So imagine this scenario for a moment, right? You've recently gone through like a really difficult
Yeah,
divorce.
those are never easy.
Not at all. But you're finally settling into a new routine. Maybe you've even moved to a new country, just to get a fresh start and put some distance between yourself and the past.
Makes total sense.
Right. So you log into your bank account exactly like you do every single month, and you initiate a standard transfer to your ex-spouse back in the Netherlands.
Just for alimony, right?
Exactly. It's to pay your legally mandated alimony. It is a completely routine, utterly mundane transaction. I mean, it's a legal obligation that you are just fulfilling.
Yeah, completely standard.
But a few days later, you go to the corner store to buy a coffee, and your card is declined. You check your phone, totally confused, and you see that your entire bank account has been frozen.
Wow, just frozen out of nowhere.
Completely. You haven't committed a crime. You haven't even, received a parking ticket in the last 5 years. But you are suddenly flagged, investigated, and forced to prove to this faceless institution that your own money, the money you earned, the money you are using to fulfill a court order, is actually legitimate.
It's wild.
Welcome to a reality where the fundamental legal concept of innocent until proven guilty has just been entirely flipped on its head in the financial sector.
It is, it's a profoundly unsettling image. And the reason we are starting with it today is that it's not a hypothetical. I mean, this is a very real situation happening to ordinary citizens right now, every single day.
Right.
We are so accustomed culturally and, legally to the idea that law enforcement has to have probable cause to investigate us. A detective can't just kick your door down because they feel like it.
No.
They need a warrant. They need actual suspicion.
Exactly. That's the baseline.
But what we are going to explore today in this deep dive is how that burden of proof has entirely shifted when it comes to your wallet. We tend to think of our banking infrastructure as like a neutral utility, sort of like water or electricity. You turn the tap, the water flows.
Right. You don't expect the water company to interrogate you about what you're using the water for.
Exactly. But the current architecture has essentially deputized these financial institutions. It has forced them to treat everyday individuals and small businesses as, well, prime suspects by default.
And that brings us to the real mission of today's deep dive. We are unpacking an incredibly detailed, just eye-opening interview with a man named Simon Lelieveld.
Yeah, his background is fascinating.
It really is. He's a former compliance officer, a business administrator, and the founder of a foundation called Human Rights in Finance, or HRIF.
Right.
We're going to look closely at how anti-money laundering laws, which, on paper sound perfectly reasonable, how they've combined with algorithmic monitoring and this massive, opaque bureaucratic machine to accidentally turn regular citizens into financial suspects.
And crucially, we're looking at how he's fighting back.
Exactly. More importantly, we are going to examine how Lelieveld is literally using the system's own labyrinth of rules and regulations to fight back.
To properly set the stage here, I think we really need to take the macro view. Our goal today is to analyze the evolution of financial surveillance, the very real geopolitical risks regarding where our data is actually hosted, and the alarming structural parallels between current banking practices and some recent devastating government scandals in the Netherlands.
Yeah, we have a lot of ground to cover.
We do. And our focus is strictly on the mechanics of this system. I want to be clear, we are not taking political sides here, but rather we're just neutrally examining the profound, documented consequences on citizens' rights as they're outlined in our source material. Right. Because this isn't just like a theoretical debate about policy. It is about the underlying architecture of how our information is processed.
Yeah.
And how that specific architecture impacts human lives.
So let's look at the numbers, because to really understand the scale of what we are talking about, the statistics are just staggering. Let's start with the sheer volume of surveillance happening right now.
The numbers are wild.
They are. In the Netherlands alone, banks are generating between 3.5 to 4 million unusual transaction reports every single year.
Which is a number that absolutely demands context. I mean, if you benchmark that figure against a broader European standard for a comparable economy with, similar financial activity, you would expect to see somewhere in the neighborhood of 45,000 of these reports annually.
Wait, 45,000?
Yes, 45,000.
So 45,000 versus nearly 4 million, that is not a margin of error.
No, not at all.
That is a massive structural discrepancy, and it immediately begs the question, why are millions of everyday transactions suddenly being flagged as suspicious? According to Lelieveld, it is absolutely not. Because a human being looked at a transaction, applied critical thinking, and said, hey, this looks like money laundering for a cartel.
Oh, definitely not.
It's because the entire system operates on rigid, automated monetary limits. You cross an arbitrary numerical threshold, and boom, you are automatically flagged.
And the defining characteristic here, the really scary part, is the complete removal of context. The system is mechanically designed to be totally blind to the actual nature of the transaction.
Right.
So a compliance officer sitting in a bank might be staring at this massive, seemingly endless data set of these so-called unusual transactions. And the sole reason they are in that pile is because of a hard-coded limit.
Just a number in a computer?
Exactly. Now, the European law actually dictates that a bank should report a transaction, regardless of the monetary amount, if there is a genuine substantive suspicion that something is wrong. Like if a human actually suspects something.
Right, which makes sense.
Right. But the domestic implementation of that law has taken the absolute path of least resistance.
Yeah.
It has defaulted to just throwing millions of totally unnecessary reports into a bucket purely based on these automated thresholds, simply to satisfy regulatory volume requirements.
Well, hold on. I want to push back on this from like a purely business perspective, because why would a commercial bank willingly spend tens of millions of dollars to build departments that do literally nothing but investigate their own innocent customers?
It sounds crazy, right?
It makes zero financial sense. Banks want to make money. They don't want to interrogate people paying alimony.
You are exactly right. It doesn't make business sense at all. They are doing it because there is essentially a regulatory gun pointed at their heads.
Wow.
Banks have been forced into the role of law enforcement. Lelieveld actually compares them to city guards for finance. If a bank fails to catch illicit funds, the regulatory fines they face are astronomical. We're talking often in the hundreds of millions or even billions of dollars.
Oh, wow. So they're terrified.
Exactly. So the banks have made a calculated, incredibly risk-averse decision. It is cheaper and safer for them to just assume guilt first. They overcomply, they flag everything that moves just to prove to the regulators that they are, quote-unquote, doing their jobs.
And that overcompliance leads to situations that are borderline comedic, well, if they weren't so invasive. The source material highlights this perfect, totally absurd example, the Albert Heijn scenario.
Oh, the grocery store one.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So for context, for anyone listening outside of the Netherlands, Albert Heijn is a massive, everyday grocery store chain. It's everywhere.
Like a Kroger or a Tesco.
Right, exactly. So imagine receiving a formal interrogation from your bank demanding that you explain why you spent €4,000 over the course of a year at a grocery store.
Which is just over €300 a month.
Right. It's groceries, you're buying bread, milk, and vegetables to feed your family over 12 months. But the algorithm doesn't possess common sense. It just sees a cumulative number that crossed some invisible line in its programming.
And when they ask you about that $4,000 grocery bill, they aren't just, like, curious. They are operating under the legal presumption that those funds might be illicit. And the burden of proof is placed entirely on you, the customer, to prove their legitimacy.
You literally have to justify buying milk.
You do. And if you cannot prove it to their exact satisfaction, or honestly, if the administrative process just becomes too cumbersome and expensive for the bank to maintain for your account, they hold the ultimate trump card. They can and will simply terminate your account.
Yeah.
You become unbanked.
Which violently collides with fundamental European rights. I mean, you have a fundamental legal right to the presumption of innocence.
Absolutely.
You have the right to be presumed innocent until a police officer conducts a proper investigation, gathers actual evidence, and a judge establishes guilt in a court of law. But in the financial sector, that foundational right has seemingly just evaporated.
It fundamentally alters the relationship between the citizen and the state. And that relationship is now being mediated by a private bank. The bank is acting as a proxy for the state's policing power. But crucially, they're doing it without the constitutional safeguards, the transparency, and the accountability that strictly constrain actual police work.
Right. A bank doesn't have a badge and a sworn oath to the Constitution.
Exactly. A compliance department, in an ideal world, should start by looking at a flagged transaction and trying to understand why a client is innocent. They should ask, does this behavior make sense for this specific person's profile?
Yeah, is this just a guy buying groceries?
Right. Instead, the paradigm is entirely reversed. Everything is suspicious, and we just have to prove it or throw the client out if we can't definitively clear them.
And the mechanics of this get even darker. Let's look at what we might call a digital stop and frisk. Because what actually happens when your 4,000 grocery bill triggers that automated flag?
This part is genuinely scary.
It really is. According to the source material, there's a deeply concerning practice where these automated threshold-based bank flags are matched up with police databases. So let's walk through this. Say you got a simple traffic ticket for speeding.
Okay, totally common.
Right. Your name is now a data point in the police system. Separately, your bank flagged you for buying too many groceries. Those two entirely separate databases are then cross-referenced.
Without you knowing.
Exactly. And if there's a match, you are instantly labeled a suspect.
And again, no human investigator looked at your file. No detective did any legwork to connect any dots whatsoever. An algorithm simply matched two entirely unrelated data points, a speeding ticket and a grocery bill, and suddenly your entire financial life is under a microscope.
Just because of bad code.
Yeah. And Lelieveld points out that while this mass matching might not be strictly permitted by privacy laws, it is practically happening.
But does it even work? I mean, does catching a million people buying groceries actually stop international drug cartels?
That is the ultimate irony here. The Dutch Court of Audit, which is this independent body that monitors government spending and efficiency, they actually released a report analyzing this massive transaction dragnet.
What did they find?
Well, they looked at the millions of reports generated. They looked at the staggering amount of money spent by banks on compliance departments, and their conclusion was devastating. They stated that they literally cannot demonstrate that this system has any real measurable effect on catching actual criminals.
Are you kidding me?
No. The yield, the actual return on investment in terms of crime reduction is entirely unknown. But the collateral damage, the consequences for the innocent citizens caught in that, are massive and well documented.
So you have this massive automated machine running blind. If you are someone sitting inside that machine, if it's your actual job to manage this compliance, how do you react? Because Leo didn't just shrug his shoulders, cash his paycheck, and accept it.
No, he really didn't.
He spent years trying to fix the plumbing from the inside. He advised the Dutch central bank. He worked with banking associations trying to use professional, substantive arguments. He was telling them, you know, this is incredibly inefficient, it's costing a fortune, and it fundamentally violates human rights.
And how did they react?
It completely fell on deaf ears. So he transitioned from being a compliance officer to an external watchdog, officially forming the foundation Human Rights in Finance.
This transition is a critical pivot in our story, really, because it marks a total shift in his tactics. When internal appeals to logic, efficiency, and proportionality fail, he decides to adopt a totally different approach. We can almost call it guerrilla compliance.
Guerrilla compliance, I like that.
Yeah. He realizes that asking the regulators nicely just isn't working. The data privacy authorities won't enforce their own rules, and the central bank refuses to change its stance. So rather than fighting the regulators head-on, he targets the underlying infrastructure that makes the surveillance possible in the first place.
And this leads to one of the most remarkable events detailed in the material. Lelieveld single-handedly stopped a mass transaction monitoring system in the Netherlands.
Just incredible.
Yeah, he didn't organize a protest in the streets. He didn't file a decade-long lawsuit. He went directly after the American cloud hosting provider, Amazon Web Services, or AWS, who's storing the data.
It's a very specific, highly aggressive lever to pull. He bypasses the stubborn domestic regulators entirely. He drafted a formal legal opinion that essentially stated, look, this banking dragnet, this mass copying and pasting of citizens' private financial information without any specific suspicion, constitutes illegal behavior under European privacy frameworks like the GDPR.
Right, he used the law against them.
Exactly. He framed the automated mass data collection as a criminal violation of proportionality. And then he sent this legal opinion directly to AWS, basically warning them that they were actively hosting illegal material on their servers.
I want to understand the mechanics of this threat, though. Why go after the web host instead of the bank itself? What leverage does he actually have over Amazon?
The leverage is entirely about risk management for AWS. Lelieveld informed AWS, you are hosting data that violates European law. You are facilitating a data crime. Very. And AWS naturally, initially pushed back. Their response was essentially, you know, who are you and how do you even know we host this specific banking system?
Right. They tried to dismiss him.
Yeah. But Lelieveld had done his homework. He simply pointed to public press releases where the banks themselves have proudly announced their new cutting-edge partnership with AWS.
Oh, that's brilliant.
But here is the mechanism that made the threat truly real. He gave AWS a 2-week deadline. He told them that if they didn't shut down the monitoring system, he was going to send his documented legal opinion to every single one of AWS's other government clients across Europe.
Oh, wow. Wait, so he's threatening their entire European business model.
Exactly. AWS is a massive multinational corporation. They rely heavily on these incredibly lucrative long-term government contracts across the entire continent.
Yeah, billions of dollars.
Right. So the threat of being publicly exposed as a facilitator of legally dubious mass surveillance for one specific Dutch client that could jeopardize their trust and their contracts everywhere else. Suddenly, what was a minor technical hosting job for AWS became an immense continent-wide legal and reputational risk.
So AWS panicked. Lelieveld had given them a deadline of a Monday morning to get on a conference call and hash it out. But instead, he wakes up that Monday, turns on the radio, and hears the news breaking that the mass transaction monitoring initiative in the Netherlands had been immediately halted.
Just overnight.
Almost overnight. One citizen used the system's own liability rules to shut down a massive surveillance apparatus. But, it raises a huge red flag for me. Why does it take a single guy sending threatening letters to a server host to enforce the privacy laws that state regulatory bodies are fully funded and mandated to uphold?
It points to a catastrophic failure in bureaucratic architecture, specifically this phenomenon of institutional inertia. When a massive regulatory system is built, the people working inside it often completely lose sight of the foundational laws it was meant to operate within in the first place. They develop severe tunnel vision, focusing solely on their specific, narrow mandate.
Which in this case is catching bad guys.
Right, maximizing the fight against money laundering. They optimize for that one single metric at the expense of everything else, including basic privacy laws and constitutional rights. The regulatory loop just becomes closed. Lelieveld action was the only way to force an external, undeniable shock into that closed loop.
And the terrifying reality is that this lack of government oversight, this institutional stubbornness, it isn't some rare anomaly. In the source material, Lelieveld draws a direct, really grim parallel between this current financial monitoring and one of the darkest, most destructive chapters in recent Dutch history, the Toezeligem affair, which translates to the childcare benefits scandal.
For those who might not be familiar with it, the childcare benefits scandal was an absolute catastrophic failure of the Dutch government. Over a period of several years, tens of thousands of innocent parents were falsely accused of severe fraud by the national tax authorities.
It was devastating.
Completely. They were ordered to immediately repay massive amounts of childcare benefits that they had legitimately received. We are talking about sums that drove working families into total financial ruin, forced bankruptcies, divorces, and just profound psychological trauma.
And crucially for our discussion today, algorithms and automated risk profiles were the primary engine of this disaster, right?
Exactly. The system was designed to heavily penalize and flag people based on discriminatory inputs, such as having a dual nationality or even just having a foreign-sounding surname.
It was a systemic human rights disaster. And Lelieveld says he studied the mechanics of that scandal really closely, and he sees the exact same architectural flaws happening right now in the financial sector.
It's a terrifying comparison.
He highlights very specific shared traits between the two. First, the use of deliberately vague definitions by state advocates to avoid accountability. Second, the intentional withholding of crucial documents during legal procedures to ensure the accused citizen cannot mount a proper defense. And third, an absolute, complete disregard for proportionality.
The psychology of how a bureaucracy actually operates in these situations is fascinating, though honestly, it's tragic. What's interesting is that Lelieveld explicitly refuses to believe this disaster is born out of pure malice.
Right, he doesn't think they're evil.
No, he doesn't think there's a secret room full of evil villains actively plotting to destroy citizens' lives. Instead, he places the blame squarely on the architecture of the system itself. He introduces this highly illustrative Dutch concept called postschuldjes, which translates literally to stamp-sized responsibilities.
Stamp-sized responsibilities, I love that visual. I mean, I imagine a massive assembly line where every single worker is only allowed to look at a space the size of a postage stamp right in front of them, completely blind to what the factory is actually building.
That is precisely the mechanism. You have a modern generation of policymakers and bureaucrats whose entire job is to optimize tiny, highly isolated subproblems without ever being required or even allowed to look at the holistic picture.
Right. They're just doing their one little job.
Exactly. For example, one person at the bank is tasked solely with increasing the raw number of flag transactions to appease the regulator. Another person in a totally different department is tasked strictly with minimizing the bank's legal liability. A third person is focused entirely on maintaining the technical database efficiency.
And none of them talk to each other.
Never. And when these individually well-meaning parts of a system operate in total isolation from one another, they combine to create this massive bureaucratic steamroller. And that steamroller blindly crushes vulnerable individuals. Lelieveld specifically points out how this affects marginalized groups. Sex workers, owners of legal coffee shops, or, as we mentioned earlier, individuals sending alimony abroad. These people are pushed entirely out of the financial system simply because their financial footprint doesn't neatly fit into the algorithm's incredibly narrow definition of normal.
The system literally depersonalizes a living, breathing citizen into a sterile policy document. But what happens when someone on the inside actually tries to pull the emergency brake?
That's where it gets even worse.
Yeah, because when Lelieveld tried to take his case to court specifically, when he tried to present his own whistleblowing documents regarding these exact practices, he faced a staggering wall of what we could really only call the obstruction of evidence.
It's unbelievable.
He formally asked the Financial Intelligence Unit, the FIU, which is the state police body that receives all of these millions of transaction reports, to present the correspondence he had sent them to the judge. He had literally sent them over 60 pages of detailed complaints, thorough legal analysis, and peer-reviewed scientific research pointing out the explicit human rights violations occurring in their system.
And the response from the FIU was to simply refuse to submit those documents to the court.
Just flat out refuse.
Yes. They claimed that everything regarding their processes was highly classified and secret. They actively tried to keep the presiding judge entirely in the dark about the fact that they had been repeatedly warned about the illegality of their actions.
So what did he do?
Well, Lelieveld, anticipating this, actually had to physically carry his own hard copies of his submitted documents into the courtroom hearing just to prove to the judge that his position and his warnings actually existed. The judge was visibly surprised to learn that extensive, months-long conversations and correspondence had taken place because the state had completely deliberately omitted them from the official record.
He had actually cornered them even before the court date, too. The material details this brilliant trap question he had asked the FIU earlier on in his correspondence.
Oh, this was so smart.
Right. He essentially asked them, hey, if a European court ever legally determines that this mass collection of data is unlawful, will you formally agree to delete everything I have sent you?
Checkmate.
Exactly. And the FIU was paralyzed. They couldn't say yes because agreeing to delete it would be an implicit admission that they were potentially at fault. But they couldn't say no because how can a democratic government body officially refuse to delete unlawfully gathered data?
So what was their move?
So instead of answering the legal question, they resorted to intimidation. They told him to keep his mouth shut, stop asking questions, and keep sending the mandatory reports, or he would personally face criminal charges for committing an economic offense.
It perfectly illustrates the ultimate siloing of information. The state is using the cloak of secrecy not to protect vital national security, but to protect its own flawed, potentially illegal administrative processes from any form of public or judicial scrutiny.
Just protecting their own jobs, basically.
Yeah. When the stakes get high and the legality of the system is challenged, the defensive mechanisms of the bureaucracy just kick in automatically, and all transparency vanishes. And this deliberate siloing, where the left hand genuinely doesn't know or deliberately chooses not to care what the right hand is doing, is exactly the fertile ground where massive financial cover-ups happen. Which brings us perfectly to the mechanics of the Triodos Bank case.
Ah, the Triodos case. This is the ultimate proof of how this illusion of oversight actively harms the public. But before we get into the actual cover-up, let's clarify the terms. The source mentions Triodos Bank's certificates and a prospectus. What exactly are those? Because they sound like standard stocks, but I assume there's a difference if we're dealing with a specific banking structure.
That's a crucial distinction, yeah. Certificates, in this context, they act very much like shares of stock. You buy them to invest in the bank and earn a return. But crucially, they do not grant the investor any voting rights in how the bank is run.
Okay, so you put your money in, but you have no say.
Exactly. It's a way for the bank to raise capital without giving up any control. A prospectus, on the other hand, is essentially the legally binding warning label and instruction manual for an investment. Before a bank can offer these certificates to the public, they must publish a prospectus that details all the financial realities, the business model, and critically, all the severe risks involved.
Okay, so investors are relying heavily on that prospectus to know if they are, walking into a trap. So let's walk through the timeline of how the regulators completely failed them. Back in 2018, the Dutch central bank, the DNB, conducted an investigation and found serious systemic violations regarding how Triodos Bank was handling these certificates.
Right.
The DNB sent Triodos a formal, severe warning letter saying, essentially, you are violating the rules and this is a major problem. Now, under financial law, when a serious violation of this magnitude is found, that warning letter is supposed to be published. The public, and specifically the investors, have a fundamental right to know that the bank they're investing in is in trouble.
But it was not published. The Dutch central bank deliberately kept that warning letter a closely guarded secret for 6 entire years.
6 years.
Yes. It wasn't finally made public until 2024. And the timing is key here. It was only published right before Triodos wanted to have its certificates formally traded on the Euronext stock exchange, a move that absolutely required a clean, transparent bill of health. But for the 6 years prior, that vital, damning information was just hidden under a heavy lid.
Why? I have to ask why. Why would the central bank, whose sole job is to ensure stability, hide a warning letter about a bank violating the rules?
It comes down to a systemic institutional fear of causing a bank run.
Panic.
Right. Regulators often operate under the belief that if they publicly announce a bank is in trouble, investors will panic, they'll pull all their money out, and the bank will collapse, creating a wider financial crisis. So they convince themselves that they're doing the right thing by hiding the danger and quietly trying to force the bank to fix it behind the scenes. They prioritize the stability of the institution over the transparency owed to the public.
But by hiding it, they created a massive secondary failure. Because that letter was kept secret by the DNB, the other major regulator, the Dutch Authority for the Financial Markets, or the AFM, which is the specific watchdog tasked with protecting consumers and investors, never saw it.
Exactly. The left hand didn't tell the right hand.
So when Triodos eventually submitted its legally required prospectus to the AFM for approval, the AFM looked at the paperwork, saw no red flags, and basically said, looks great. They gave it their official stamp of approval. They endorsed it completely blindly because they were missing the primary critical facts that the central bank was actively hiding from them.
And the devastating domino effect of that bureaucratic failure falls squarely on the shoulders of the listener, the everyday consumer or retail investor. Investors bought into these Triodos certificates, placing their trust entirely in the AFM's official stamp of approval.
They trusted the system?
Yeah, they assumed the government watchdog had done its job. So when the situation inevitably collapsed and investors lost massive amounts of their savings, they went to civil court to seek compensation. But the civil courts ruled against the investors.
Wait, really? Why?
Because the bank had a perfect legal shield. They could simply point to the AFM and say, look, the government regulator approved our prospectus. We did everything by the book according to them.
So if the central bank is hiding the danger and the consumer watchdog is blindly endorsing the dangerous product, and the courts are relying on that blind endorsement to dismiss the victims, who is actually protecting the public?
It's a complete collapse of accountability.
It really is. Lelieveld points out that these regulatory bodies simply refuse to communicate with each other. And more infuriatingly, they absolutely refuse to let citizens or NGOs tell them how to do their jobs. When he writes formal letters to them, laying out these exact legal contradictions and failures, they don't engage with the facts. They respond with endless procedural excuses to avoid dealing with the substance of his complaints.
It is an institutional stubbornness rooted in a deeply ingrained belief that the regulatory system is fundamentally infallible.
They think they can't be wrong.
Exactly. The authorities operate with a mindset that they possess the ultimate expertise, and that any outside interference, even when it explicitly points out blatant legal contradictions or, human rights violations, is merely an administrative annoyance, just something to be swatted away using legal technicalities.
And if this level of domestic institutional failure is bad, if our own local watchdogs cannot communicate or protect our investments, what happens when you take that exact same flawed system and hand the keys to your entire national digital identity over to a foreign superpower?
This is where the stakes get incredibly high.
Yeah, because that is exactly the crisis that almost unfolded with the DigiD system.
Right. To understand the stakes here, we really need to define DigiD. It is the foundational digital identity infrastructure in the Netherlands. It is a single digital key that citizens use to access almost every aspect of their civic life.
It's everything.
It's how you log in to file your taxes, how you access your highly sensitive medical records, how you apply for government benefits. The sheer volume of sensitive, centralized data is astronomical. And the company that currently hosts this massive platform, Solvinity, was in the advanced stages of being acquired by an American technology firm called Kyndryl.
And once again, Simon Lelieveld and the HRIF Foundation intervened. They launched a campaign to stop it, which ultimately resulted in the Dutch government actually halting the takeover. But to truly understand why this was such a critical battle and why an American buyout of a Dutch server host is so dangerous, we have to synthesize this 50-year historical timeline on U.S. data surveillance that Lelieveld outlines.
It's quite a history lesson.
It is absolutely wild, and it paints a very clear picture of the geopolitical reality.
The geopolitical threat here is not some abstract paranoia, It is built on decades of documented historical precedent. Lelieveld traces a timeline that begins in the aftermath of World War II with a company called Crypto AG.
Oh, this story's crazy.
It really is. This was a Swiss company that manufactured high-end encryption devices for secure, classified communication. For decades, they were considered the absolute gold standard globally. Embassies, militaries, and governments across Europe and the world bought these devices to keep their secrets safe.
But there was a catch. A massive, world-altering catch.
Exactly. What the world didn't know until much, much later was that Crypto AG was secretly owned and operated by the U.S. Central Intelligence Agency and the West German intelligence apparatus.
They owned the company making the locks.
Yes, they intentionally engineered a backdoor into the hardware of the devices. They created an A version for themselves and their closest intelligence allies, which was genuinely secure. But they sold a B version to everyone else, including allied European nations, which contained a flaw that allowed U.S. and German intelligence to easily decrypt and read every single secure message sent by these foreign governments for decades.
So the United States has a long, highly established, and incredibly successful national sport of global surveillance.
That's one way to put it, yeah.
I want to pause on that, though, because that is hardware. But as technology evolved into the digital internet age, the U.S. government didn't stop. They actively worked to sabotage global digital security standards. The source mentions they pressured IBM to weaken something called the BES encryption algorithm in the 1970s. How does a government legally mandate weaker math?
Think of encryption like a combination lock on a safe. If a safe has a combination lock with 10 dials, it might take a supercomputer 100 years to guess every possible combination to crack it.
Okay.
What the U.S. government, specifically the National Security Agency, the NSA, did was pressure IBM to shorten the key length of the DES algorithm. So in our analogy, they forced the manufacturer to build the lock with only 3 dials instead of 10.
Wow, just making it intentionally easy to break into.
Exactly.
Yeah.
They didn't want unbreakable locks on the digital doors of the world because they wanted to ensure that the NSA would always possess the massive computing power required to crack those locks whenever they deemed it necessary.
And then you move into the modern financial era. The Financial Action Task Force, or FATF, was created ostensibly with a noble goal, right? To combat international drug money.
Right. It sounds good on paper.
But what it actually did was establish a global architecture of transaction monitoring that perfectly positioned U.S. authorities to gain unprecedented insight into global financial flows. After the September 11th attacks, this accelerated dramatically. Within weeks of the attacks, the CIA had covertly gained total access to the SWIFT database.
Which is massive.
Yeah, SWIFT is the central global messaging system that handles almost all international bank transfers. It took 5 full years for the European public and European politicians to even find out this was happening, and they only found out because it was leaked to the press.
And just when European regulators thought they had finally negotiated some robust safeguards, safe harbor agreements to protect their citizens' data from the U.S., Edward Snowden steps forward in 2013.
Oh yeah, that changed everything.
He leaks the NSA documents and essentially tells the world, you have absolutely no idea what is actually happening. He revealed the true, staggering extent of NSA mass surveillance programs like PRISM, which were tapping directly into the servers of major U.S. tech companies. The so what for the listener here is simple and brutal. If your data enters U.S. legal jurisdiction or is hosted by a U.S. company, your European data privacy rights are essentially extinguished.
Because U.S. law specifically acts like the Cloud Act, compels companies under its jurisdiction to hand over data when requested by U.S. authorities, regardless of where that data is physically stored in the world.
Right, geography doesn't matter.
Exactly. An American company could have a server sitting in downtown Amsterdam, but if the U.S. government issues a subpoena, that company has to comply. And no bank or tech company will ever risk defying the U.S. government. Why? Because the U.S. possesses a financial kill switch.
The ultimate weapon in the U.S. arsenal is its sanctions regime, combined with the absolute dominance of the U.S. dollar. If a company or a bank is deemed to be violating U.S. sanctions or refusing to cooperate, they can be entirely cut off from the U.S. dollar clearing system and the global financial network.
The source gives a specific example of the French bank BNP Paribas, which was hit with a staggering $9 billion fine by the U.S.
$9 billion.
But hold on, if a French bank is operating out of Paris, dealing with clients in countries that the French government hasn't sanctioned, how does the U.S. swoop in and demand $9 billion?
It comes down to the plumbing of global finance. Even if a transaction doesn't touch American soil, if it is denominated in U.S. dollars, it eventually has to clear through a correspondent bank in the United States.
Ah, so they always have a hook.
Exactly. Because BNP Paribas processed dollar transactions for entities in Sudan and Cuba, countries sanctioned by the U.S. claimed jurisdiction.
Yeah.
That $9 billion fine sent a massive shockwave through the global financial system. It created such an intense climate of fear that global banks and service providers will now preemptively dump entirely legal European clients or massively overcomply with U.S. data demands just to ensure they don't accidentally anger the American regulators.
Wow.
Therefore, if you hand your national digital ID infrastructure to a U.S. company, you are placing your citizens' most sensitive data squarely inside that kill switch blast radius.
But beyond the massive geopolitical threat, there is also the sheer baffling commercial absurdity of this specific deal with Kyndryl. Lelieveld analyzed the actual business reality of this acquisition, and it made absolutely zero sense.
Right. Kyndryl is not some cutting-edge, hyper-secure technology giant. It is a spin-off company created by IBM. Essentially, IBM took all of its legacy, low-margin, outdated mainframe maintenance contracts, the heavy, dying parts of the business that they didn't want dragging down their future growth in AI and cloud computing. They bundled all that legacy weight up and spun it off as a separate entity called Kyndryl.
They just dumped it.
Yeah. Lelieveld analyzes it as a struggling business model, a low-margin operation that is fighting just to survive in a modern tech landscape.
And the timing of this proposed government contract was just incredible. Right around the time the Dutch government was seriously debating whether to trust this specific company with the keys to the nation's digital identity, Kyndryl experienced a massive internal shakeup. Their chief financial officer and their chief legal counsel both suddenly quit.
Always a great sign.
Oh, totally. Furthermore, Kyndryl was forced to publicly admit in an official filing to the U.S. Securities and Exchange Commission, the SEC, that their own internal risk management framework was unreliable. And as a result, their financial reporting couldn't be fully trusted.
They literally told their own investors in a legally binding document, our internal risk management is broken.
Unbelievable.
And yet, despite this glaring red flag, the Dutch government was sitting in Parliament having serious, straight-faced discussions about the risk mitigation measures they could hypothetically put into a contract with Kyndryl to protect the DigiD system. Lelieveld is reading these parliamentary reports thinking, are you kidding me? You are about to hand the most important data infrastructure in the country to a company that just legally admitted it doesn't know how to drive.
Which brings us to the bureaucratic stonewalling that Lelieveld faced when he tried to stop this. When he formally requested that the government halt the takeover, citing these massive documented security and commercial risks, he encountered a phenomenon he calls the Z-felling the soap slope. It's a brilliant metaphor.
The soap slope.
Yeah.
You try to climb it to get a straight answer or a legal ruling, and the bureaucracy just ensures you slide right back down into the mud without ever gaining traction.
How exactly did they apply the soap slope to him?
He was very precise in his attack. He sent his legal letters demanding a halt to the acquisition, using specific high-level European laws, namely Articles 346 and 347 of the Treaty on the Functioning of the European Union.
Okay, heavy hitters.
Right. These specific articles explicitly allow a member state to block commercial transactions if they threaten essential national security interests. He intentionally didn't even tell the Dutch government which specific domestic administrative law he was applying under. He just presented them with the overriding European imperative and the 50-year history of why handing data to the U.S. was a catastrophic security risk.
And how did the state advocate, the lawyers defending the government, respond to this massive national security warning? By refusing to even use the word application or formal request in the written replies back to him.
Semantic games.
Exactly. They attempted to legally pretend that his detailed, legally cited letters were just casual, everyday correspondence from a concerned citizen, rather than formal administrative requests.
And the reason they played that semantic game is entirely about denying legal standing. If the government formally acknowledged his letter as an official administrative request, and they subsequently rejected it, Lelieveld would then have the legal right to file an official objection.
Ah, and then he could take them to court.
Yes, he would have the right to demand to be heard in a formal setting, and he would have the right to demand access to all the underlying documents and risk assessments the government was hiding. By playing semantic tricks and refusing to classify his letter correctly, they were aggressively sliding him off the soap slope solely to prevent him from gaining the legal standing necessary to challenge them in court.
It is a profound, depressing failure of civic engagement. You have a recognized NGO using publicly available financial data and established historical analysis, raising a massive red flag about national security, and the state's first instinct is to employ semantic legal tricks just to ignore them.
Fortunately, though, due to mounting public pressure and likely the irrefutable logic of the arguments HRF provided, the acquisition was eventually blocked.
Thank goodness.
Yeah. But the battle to be formally recognized in the ongoing legal fallout of that decision continues.
This massive drive toward the centralization of digital identity and the intense ongoing struggle over who ultimately controls our data leads us perfectly into our final major theme: the evolution of money itself and what the algorithmic future holds for our wallets. Lelieveld paints a comprehensive picture of how payment systems have evolved over the last century, and it is a very clear, steady march toward total centralization and the complete loss of individual control.
Let's walk through that timeline, because it really puts the current crisis into perspective. He points out that money used to be a hyperlocal infrastructure. In 1918 in the Netherlands, you had municipal gyro systems. This was literally city-level banking.
Wow, city level.
Yeah, the infrastructure was entirely contained within the municipality. Then, as commerce grew, it scaled to the national level.
Yeah.
In 1965, the Netherlands successfully introduced a national payment check system. And the specific strategic reason they built their own national system was to keep expensive foreign U.S. credit cards out of their domestic market. They wanted to maintain sovereign control over their own payment rails.
And for decades, that model worked. It evolved into robust European systems. But eventually, around 2015, there was a massive shift. There was essentially a surrender to U.S. infrastructure. European payment systems became deeply, inextricably intertwined with American technology companies and American payment rails like MasterCard and Visa. Europe lost its sovereign control over the physical plumbing of its own money.
And now we are facing the next layers of this evolution, which move entirely away from traditional banks. We have the rise of internet payment giants. We have big tech companies actively trying to build parallel financial systems. Remember a few years ago when Facebook tried to launch its own global cryptocurrency?
Oh, yeah, Libra, right. That was wild.
Exactly. That terrified central banks around the world because if a platform like Facebook, which has billions of users, held even a fraction of global users' money, they could instantly manipulate entire global financial markets entirely outside of any regulatory control.
Exactly. Then you also have companies like Apple and Google running massive payment infrastructures. They conveniently avoid strict traditional financial banking regulation by structuring their systems as prepaid service credits or digital wallets rather than formal bank accounts.
It's a huge loophole.
They operate in a massive regulatory gray area. And finally, the absolute frontier we are standing on right now: the push toward tokenized assets, broad cryptocurrency adoption, and specifically central bank digital currencies or CBDCs.
What exactly is a CBDC in this context, and why is Europe so worried about the big tech alternatives?
So a CBDC is essentially a digital version of a country's fiat currency, issued directly by the central bank rather than a commercial bank. The panic over big tech, what Lelieveld calls the systemic big tech threat, is exactly why the European Union rushed to create the MiCA regulations, which stands for the Markets in Crypto Assets Regulation.
Oh, I see.
Yeah, the regulators realized that if a tech giant created a successful digital coin, it could overnight become an unregulated global shadow bank, entirely bypassing the European financial system. MiCA was designed as an emergency brake to try and bring those digital assets under the existing regulatory umbrella. But the tragic irony is that while regulators are focused on fighting big tech, the traditional regulated banking system that they are defending is rapidly evolving into an algorithmic nightmare for the average person.
And here is the ultimate warning for you, the listener, regarding where this is all heading. The future of your bank account is not a friendly teller who knows your name and understands your business. The future involves automated algorithmic pauses on your daily transactions.
It's pretty bleak.
It is. Lelieveld describes upcoming European regulations that will grant authorities the power to simply freeze a transaction for up to 2 weeks for investigation.
I want you to truly imagine the practical reality of that. You save up your money for months to buy a 2500 television for your family. You go to the store, you swipe your card, and the system suddenly flags the transaction.
Just denied.
Not because buying a TV is illegal, but because a black box algorithm decided that spending 2,500 euro on a Tuesday afternoon statistically deviates from your usual historical purchasing pattern. Your own money is frozen for 2 weeks while a machine investigates you. And Lelieveld's ultimate terrifying fear is that in the very near future, you won't even have the luxury of calling a human compliance officer to explain the situation and clear it up.
You will be fighting a hallucinating AI bot. If the current human-led system is already deeply flawed and highly discriminatory, as we clearly saw with the horrific outcomes of the child care scandal and the millions of useless banking reports generated every year, an AI-led system, which will inevitably be trained on that exact same flawed, discriminatory historical data, will be a dystopian nightmare.
You'll just be talking to a wall.
Exactly. You will be spending your afternoon arguing with a chatbot that confidently denies your completely legitimate transactions and utterly refuses to acknowledge reality because its programming tells it you are suspicious.
It creates a system of total, inescapable friction for the innocent, while doing very little to actually stop the sophisticated multinational money launderers who know exactly how to structure their transactions to fly perfectly under the algorithm's radar.
They know how to game the system. Everyday people don't.
So, bringing this all back down to earth, what does this actually mean for you and me? What is the actionable advice here? Lelieveld says, honestly, do not try to fight the government alone on this.
Definitely not.
If your account is frozen, don't try to climb the soap slope by yourself. The machinery is simply too massive, the legal fees will bankrupt you, and the semantic tricks will exhaust you. He strongly advises supporting the NGOs, like his foundation, that have the expertise to fight these structural battles in the courts.
Well, that makes sense.
But he also mentions a terrifying, very practical detail happening right now: the government literally refusing to accept legal cash for tax payments. Are we being forcefully, intentionally pushed entirely out of the traditional financial system?
It certainly appears that way. When a citizen actively attempts to pay their taxes in cash, which is the legal tender of the land, and the National Tax Authority flatly refuses to accept it, despite clear guidelines from the European Central Bank stating that they must accept cash, it demonstrates a system that is aggressively narrowing the avenues of financial freedom.
It's forcing everyone into the digital net.
Exactly. It forces the individual citizen to seriously reconsider their total reliance on a centralized system that no longer provides them with basic legal protections, privacy, or even the option to use physical money.
So, to summarize the core lesson from this incredibly deep dive, the architecture of our modern financial and data systems is heavily, dangerously fragmented. You have thousands of individuals operating purely on their tiny, stamp-sized responsibilities, never looking at the big picture, and the collective result of that fragmentation is a catastrophic loss of the fundamental presumption of innocence.
It's just a machine running on autopilot.
Exactly. The watchdogs are deliberately hiding information from each other. The state continuously uses the excuse of secrecy to hide its own flaws and illegalities, and our most sensitive personal data is constantly at risk of being sucked into foreign jurisdictions.
And while it is vital to recognize that the individuals working within this system often have genuinely good intentions, Lelieveld specifically notes that well-meaning bureaucrats frequently leak internal documents to watchdogs like HRIF because they personally know the system is deeply broken. The machinery itself is inherently dangerous. It fundamentally prioritizes automated compliance metrics, raw data collection, and algorithmic flags over human rights, proportionality, and basic common sense.
This isn't just high-level, abstract, policy wonk stuff meant for politicians to debate. This is about your daily life. It is about your bank account. It's about your digital identity. It's about your fundamental human right to privacy and your right to be presumed innocent until proven otherwise.
Absolutely.
If the system is fundamentally broken, knowledge is absolutely your first line of defense. Understanding exactly how these algorithms work, understanding the geopolitical reality of where your data is actually hosted, and perhaps even actively diversifying your assets so you aren't reliant on a single point of failure. These are the practical ways you protect yourself when the institutional cover from the government completely vanishes.
It demands a much more active, critical engagement from all of us regarding the digital tools, banking platforms, and conveniences we take for granted every single day.
Mm.
We can no longer afford to assume that digital convenience equates to security, privacy, or fairness.
Exactly. And I want to leave you with a final lingering thought to mull over today as you go about your week. We've spent this time talking about how this massive system automatically flags the unusual, how it actively punishes any deviation from the statistical norm.
Right.
If our financial systems are now built to automatically treat any slight deviation as highly suspicious, how is this invisible, constant surveillance already changing your behavior?
That is the real question.
Are we already unconsciously self-censoring what we buy, which organizations we choose to support, and how we choose to live our lives, just to ensure we don't accidentally trigger a silent algorithm that we aren't even allowed to see? Until next time, keep diving deep.